Bom dia a todos e a todas.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here with you this morning. I'd like to thank our audience and also those who are online. This event is a hybrid one. I'd like to thank the organizing committee for organizing this committee focused on the pharmaceutical industry. That's so important for us in Brazil, and for choosing those speakers. I welcome them, and I'm very glad that they accepted our invitation. The theme of the panel is the data protection in pharmaceutical industry. As we all know, this industry is intensive in research and development, and in the last few years we've seen very interesting growth focused in innovation and a restructuring of the industry. When I started in this area many years ago, I started in Oswaldo Cruz Foundation in the patent area. I'm talking about the 90s. And Fiocruz wanted to structure its technology transfer area and industrial property, moved by an innovative spirit. So the pharmaceutical industry is very intensive in research. Innovation goes through the whole discussion, and we talk about competition. We want to be sustainable, and if we want to be competitive in the global area, we have to go on investing in R&D. And we are going to talk about two different subjects today. One is going to be talked about Professor Caitlin. Caitlin Mulholland is known to most of us. She is a professor at the Catholic University and director of the law course. She's a doctor in civil rights, and she also coordinates artificial intelligence and the law. She's also member of the Federal Board of OAB and the protection of data. And she was a former board member of ANPD. Thank you, Caitlin, for being here. She's going to talk about the ethical issues and the protection of personal data in clinical research. Clinical research is very relevant in the pharmaceutical area. It's an area of great opportunities for growth. Brazil has a very diversified population, and to strengthen this area in Brazil is very important in our scenario. And Caitlin is going to talk about personal data protection within the pharmaceutical area. The other theme we are going to talk about this morning is the protection of regulatory data for registration to be commercialized. In Brazil, we have a special regime of law 10,603 that excluded humans for protection, and we have a temporary protection for fertilizers, agricultural defensives, and veterinary. Although we have different articles in the law of industrial property and mechanisms to protect unlawful competition. We have Mr. Christian Jervelund. It's a pleasure.
Christian came from Denmark to our lovely city in Rio, And Christian will present a very interesting discussion about research that he did related to the subject matter. Christian is a partner at Copenhagen Economics, a consulting company and one of the leading economics firms in Europe. He leads the company's healthcare life science practice, and he's a skilled mediator, negotiator, and public speaker with a master's degree in economics. I will give the floor to Christian. He will start his presentation, and then Caitlin can come here and stay with us for the remaining of the time. At the end, there will be time for questions as well, so thank you so much for being here.
Christian, you have the floor.
Good morning, everyone, and a pleasure to be here. And thank you very much for the invitation to have me come here and present the study that we did on implications of introducing regulatory data protection in Brazil. It's a very hot topic, and for good reason. Therefore, it's an important occasion today to be able to share with you the findings, to, in that sense, stimulate the discussion and look at the potential consequences of introducing regulatory data protection for pharmaceuticals. So first about myself. As Anna Cristina said, I am a partner with Copenhagen Economics. It's a European consultancy with global reach. We do incentive analysis like this and been very active in Europe, analyzing various protection mechanisms over the past many years, both for the European Commission and private companies on consequences of revising the incentive regime in Europe. And now we have done this study here today. It's available on our website. It's available to download, which is called Regulatory Data Protection for Pharmaceuticals, and that's what I'm going to share with you today. We also work in the area of supporting disputes, conflicts around linked to competition law, could be also IP-related disputes linked to competition law, as economists supporting those types of analysis and conflicts. This is the team that I'm working with, and many of those have been part of this project that I'll be telling you about today. All right, let's get into it. What is regulatory data protection? Well, it's an intellectual property right, which provides a period of protection for clinical trials and other test data. So think about it as something, as a means of protection that works, let's say, alongside or in combination with patents. So a patent is there to protect the initial invention. It's being patented, then it can be disclosed and shared, and that insight can be used by others to, do further research and further R&D. But then alongside that is the regulatory data protection that then incentivizes and protects the data package that is being developed as the invention tries to take it from an invention to a medicine, and that medicine is being tested in clinical trials for efficacy and safety, and that data package is what is being used to, when you submit to Anvisa or other regulatory bodies for approval and the ability to market eventually that medicine in that country. And the regulatory data protection is then protecting the use of that data package so that another company cannot use that as soon as it's available and then try to seek approval of a generic medicine right after the free of charge, because it can reuse that protection package. Now that means when regulatory data protection expires, it's free to then, anyone can then reference to that data package and seek approval of a generic medicine subsequently. So and then in that sense, the two protection mechanisms, the patents and the regulatory data protection, work alongside each other in incentivizing the continued, first the invention and then the continued development of that invention towards a safe and effective medicine. So the big thing is, what kind of consequences could we foresee? We did this research looking at actual data across more than 50 countries covering more than 10 years, countries that had introduced regulatory data protection, and compared those basically to countries that had not, to try and see if we could tease out the effects of introducing regulatory data protection and putting that in the Brazilian context. So it all starts with availability. If you are, one of the big main hypotheses is that companies will be hesitant to launch new innovative medicines in countries if they do not seek or enjoy the protection of the data package. They'll keep less, that means less marketing of medicines, innovative medicines in those countries that lack regulatory data protection. When we just look at the crude numbers that I'm showing you here, we see the top graph are markets or countries that do have regulatory data protection compared to those that do not. And the percentages, you can see the threefold difference. That in itself suggests that countries, on average, that have regulatory data protection, they have a much larger share of medicines available anywhere in the world compared to other countries. So the percentages in itself reflects that we're looking at last 5-year period and then saying, anywhere in the world where was a medicine made available or could be marketed. And then we look at all the countries with regulatory data protection to see, okay, how many of those countries did then have also access to that medicine or where it was also marketed. So you see a big difference. Now, there are many reasons, not only regulatory data protection. I mean, some markets are big, like Brazil. You would imagine that more companies would launch and make their products available because it's just a big population, a lot of potential patients to help with that medicine, whereas a small country, you would probably see less. Could also see the type of prices that you could expect to get in a country would also impact. High-priced countries would probably see more launches. So we tried using statistical methodologies where we try to isolate the impact of regulatory data protection from the rest, and we actually find a quite significant share. Look at the 11.1 to the very left. That was the low graph from before, the markets without regulatory data protection, and look at the big column to the right, the 31.5. That was the top graph from before with markets with regulatory data protection. But we try then to tease out what drives this difference, because as I just said, there are other factors that are driving the difference. But we actually find that around 9.2% percentage point between the 11.1 to 31.5, that's around half, 45%, that's around half the difference, can actually be attributed to regulatory data protection. So a lot of other factors are very important. That's what we have, other factors. But actually almost half of the difference can be explained by the absence or non-absence of regulatory data protection. So that's quite significant and goes to support the hypothesis that, yes, companies do react, in fact, to the presence or non-presence of regulatory data protection when they decide to try and seek approval and market their treatments in a country. We also looked at some specific case studies. One case here of countries where we had data available, try to look at specific countries that had introduced regulatory data protection recently to see if we could try and find also this pattern. Again, we used statistical methods to try and isolate the effect of regulatory data protection. So we tried to let's say, create a counterfactual. Here for Taiwan, where we had some good data, and that was we were able to track, let's say, the time of regulatory data protection, some data years before and after. We find that the dotted line, that's the counterfactual that we estimated what would have been the availability of innovative medicines without regulatory data protection. So that's the use of these statistical methodologies to try and isolate and tease out the effects. And you have the full line, which is the actual development that you saw in Taiwan post regulatory data protection. So you do see a spread here of 8%. It's pretty close to the 9% that we found when we looked at the entire statistical model across all countries and all periods. So we believe it's quite of a solid, let's say, finding. If we were now to take a step back and look at Brazil, you see the 11.1 to the very left and the 31.5 to the right. You're familiar with these numbers by now. And Brazil is actually at 23.1, so it's not the same as all the average of markets without regulatory data protection. That was a little bit expected because Brazil is a large market, so you would probably expect to see more launches than the average country. But we believe, based on the analysis that we just showed, that there's a potential for Brazil with regulatory data protection, that we should see more approval for companies for innovative treatments to be available, actually up towards around 32.2%, or very close to the average of the current markets enjoying regulatory data protection. So we see quite a big potential, and that companies will in fact make other decisions going forward when deciding to market in Brazil. Now, that was on availability. What about some of the important implications and consequences? Because we see more medicine coming in. A big concern we know in countries that are discussing regulatory data protection. Right now in Europe, we're actually discussing as well changing the current regime of regulatory data protection. One of the big issues is, how is this going to affect expenditure? We get more medicines coming in, and maybe longer, are we protecting some medicines for longer, deterring in the inflow of cheaper generics? This is a very important aspect that we spent quite some time looking into. What we found across countries, and here I'm showing you a case study specifically here for Canada, looking at expenditure. We actually found good evidence that we tend to see expenditure increase for a while, 10, 15 years maybe, up to here in this example around 10 years, before it kind of seems to level back to the original path of expenditure. And that could be consistent with new available medicines coming in. We just saw companies will market more. There'll be a stronger opportunity to use more expensive, innovative, and also expensive medicines. That may temporarily push up cost, but it seems to be more of a transitory phenomenon, not something that by definition leads to permanently higher expenditure. This is again this case study approach where the full line is the actual development of healthcare expenditure after introducing regulatory data protection in Canada, and the dotted line you see is this counterfactual that we have estimated using statistical methods. And you see how they get apart after introduction of regulatory data protection, but they seem to meet again at a later point in time. So this more transitory phenomenon. We're quite intrigued by this. What might that suggest? Well, first we find that availability of new medicines will have probably an increased pressure on the healthcare system to deploy and use these new medicines. That will increases quality of life and treatment options. That of course comes at a cost. But over time it seems that both you are getting rid of ineffective treatments. That's a saving, and at the same time, in the end, it seems also that politicians, regulators, those in charge of the healthcare budgets are over time in control of how much you want as a country in tax-paid systems to spend on healthcare. It's not like just because you have new treatments available, it spirals out of control. It's something that's under the control. You can instill processes and ways of looking at the usage of medicines and other expensive treatments and surgery and so forth. And in the end, it seems to be guiding the healthcare expenditure. But there's also a very other interesting part, and that's around the concern that if you put in place regulatory data protection, you will extend the effective protection length of innovative medicines, right? So you'll have longer until we get the cheaper generics to enter. Now, longer period without cheap generics, that pushes up healthcare cost. That's a real concern when we discuss regulatory data protection. But this is the interesting finding that we found. Yes, you get new medicines. We just saw that. We would expect to see an increase of new medicines available that Brazil does not have today. But so the point is, what about the existing medicine, the medicine that would anyway get in? Also in the future, the medicine that is not, let's say, affected by the presence of regulatory data protection or not. We actually find that of the current medicines, most of them, up to 85%, are actually protected by the patent that is in place. So if we look at an example where let's assume 5 years of regulatory data protection, we find that 85% of the current innovative medicines in Brazil, they are actually protected by at least 5 years of patent protection. So that means de facto, I'm not talking about the new medicines coming in, because those are of course new, driven by the presence of data protection. I'm talking about the baseline medicine offering available today and in the future that we would have and Brazil would have without data protection. Very few of those would actually experience a de facto effective extension of protection because of data protection, because the patents are in place. Now, if you think about it, that kind of makes sense. The idea is that we see quite a big reaction for companies when we introduce regulatory data protection. They will start markets more because they enjoy the protection of their data package. But then what about the medicines that they do in fact already today without data protection that they market? Well, they actually, it seems that there's a pattern. They will tend to market those that enjoy a significant period of protection by the patent. So it's kind of a self-selection bias, right? Current medicines, they enjoy quite a nice protection period. So adding regulatory data protection will not really add so much for most. Whereas, of course, the new medicines, they are there because they weren't marketed without regulatory data protection. So that's a very, I think, important piece of information and data in this kind of discussions around how will this affect protection periods. And in fact, we also find that this is the new added availability, the new availability of more medicines, innovative medicines, is a fuel for the generic and biosimilar industry. It's a very strong, effective machine in Brazil, the generic and biosimilar industry. And by adding over time more innovative medicines because of RDP, that industry is actually fueled with more medicines that it over time can produce and turn into generic. And you have this kind of ecosystem that is now fueled with more raw material, if you will. Innovative medicine is launched in the bottom. Medicine is sold exclusively for a period. After protection expires, generic entry is enabled, and if that occurs, healthcare systems benefit from lower prices and can reuse that money to invest and spend in other parts of the healthcare system for new innovative drugs, for example. So this ecosystem is extremely important. The debate in Europe, I spoke to recently to Medicines for Europe. That's the trade organization in Europe for the generic and biosimilar industry. And they're very supportive of protection mechanisms, of innovative medicines being launched as much as possible, because it does fuel their members' business model. What they're concerned about are various ways to try and manipulate and you know, get more protection that was intended by the patent system. That's really where they focus their effort. But in general, the ecosystem is such that more innovative medicine gives more rise to more revenue, more business for the generic industry, and more savings over time. In fact, we find that looking across countries, more than 3 generics are available or biosimilars to an innovative medicine. It's a strong business in Brazil. It's actually above the average of 2.5 across countries. So just to suggest or signify the importance and strength of the generic industry in Brazil. So it's a well-functioning machine that would receive more raw material. I've spoken now about, let's say, the core of the study and its findings related to availability, healthcare expenditure that might see an increase in the short term, but managed over time, and then this very interesting and important phenomenon that most existing medicines will not really enjoy a longer protection period. But we also find that investments seem to go up as a consequence of regulatory data protection being introduced. Investments via clinical trials. Now, this is extremely important because that means that there are other potential benefits that a society and Brazil could benefit from. Look at this graph. Again, the markets with regulatory data protection on top and the markets without in the bottom. And this is the number of clinical trials per million people in these countries. So you see a big difference. Markets with regulatory data protection, they have many more investments, many more clinical trials. than countries without. Now again, many reasons for that. If we try and isolate the effect, it means that the markets without regulatory data protection, they enjoy 4 clinical trials per million capita. But actually, with the effect of data protection would add almost 3. So it's not half of the reason for the clinical trials, but it actually suggests that regulatory data protection in itself will tend to drive investments through clinical trials. We know that makes sense because once countries or companies start to invest or launch more in a country, they start to build up infrastructure and they start to be more, let's say, invested in that market, which over time makes sense for them to start investing and also creating data from that particular market to be able to service Anvisa and the regulatory bodies. So it's something we see as a consequence that companies that are launching more, making more of their products available, will also find it more, will also be incentivized to bring more clinical trials and investments to the country. Now that's important because that can be used going forward. Yeah, looking here at some of the specific cases that we also looked at, again, trying to tease out the effect, looking at a number of different countries that show this tendency to increase clinical trials. Not immediately after regulatory data protection, because it takes time to plan the trials and so forth, but after a while we do see upsides. Japan is an interesting case in the bottom where there was an upside over time and then new changes were made that effectively reduced the protection period, and we also see that as a consequence that the clinical trial numbers were actually then dropping again. If Brazil were, according to our estimations, were to introduce regulatory data protection and over time see this influx of investment through clinical trials, Brazil could change its ranking from currently 2.1 to around almost 5. So an increase in number of clinical trials. It's still quite far behind some of the most advanced countries that has strong innovative industries, but it would bring increased investments. So clinical regulatory data protection also adds to the investment level through clinical trials. And that is actually, turns out, is the first building block of a successful life science strategy. When we look at the countries across the globe that have successful, innovative pharma industries and life science industries, they start with a baseline of a good patent and protection system that includes regulatory data protection. That leads to more influx of clinical trials. But on top of that, they built on, you can build on that, and some countries are putting in place actual life science strategies to support the development of an innovative life science industry by, number 2, supporting a research ecosystem, using universities as powerhouses, develop new skills, and have strong data infrastructure, because the ability to reuse data and share data and use that for research and in clinical trials is a very effective and efficient way to develop new medicines. And finally, in the end, we also see strong access to capital, incubator environments, and entrepreneurship that will help drive further an attractive industry. And just to put some final numbers on, we said, okay, if Brazil were to leverage on regulatory data protection, that would allow it to develop an innovative industry. If it were to actually put in place a life science strategy and could end up with looking like Germany or UK, some good examples of mature and good countries for innovative pharma industries, there would be a potential to increase GDP and jobs as well by a significant amount. These numbers to the very right show the direct, indirect, and induced. That means the direct impact on a larger industry, indirect through suppliers that are servicing that industry that would also grow, and finally the induced effect by having more people making good wages and can spend that in the economy and going to the movies and so forth. And so in all, when we look at the entire what we call footprint, we see a contribution from a life science strategy as depicted here that could go up from the current $18 billion in supported GDP to 24.7, so a significant increase as well. And the important thing is, this comes, let's say, as a side effect or on top of the fact that Brazil could introduce regulatory data protection to get more medicines on the market. But as a side effect, it's actually the first building block of an innovative industry. Thank you so much. And yes, looking forward to having questions.
Thank you, Christian. Amazing presentation. Certainly a very hot topic. Certainly the audience will have questions in the end for you and for Caitlin as well. I will let the questions for the end. I have my own questions, but I'm gonna give the floor to Caitlin. Caitlin, por favor, prazer recebê-la aqui.
It's a pleasure to receive you. Caitlin will talk about personal data protection. Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me well? I'm confused about this system. I hope you are not as confused as I am. My presentation is going to be, but first of all, I'd like to give you a disclaimer about my position here as a speaker. I'm a researcher and a professor in the area of civil law, and I'm a researcher about data protection and privacy for more than so many years. I don't know how many. I won't tell you how many years I've been working in this area. One of the most important aspects of research about data protection, a relevant aspect because it's related to the human being specifically, is the one related to clinical research that are done with human beings for pharmaceutical industry, for the development of drugs. But we can talk about clinical research, including people for the development not only of drugs, but also for development of treatment that can be considered efficient and necessary for the development of people's health as well as public policies in the health area here. So my presentation will be sort of out of the box of industrial intellectual property and patents and talk about something that comes before the constitution of medical data or data related to the development of drugs per se. That is, this thinking out of the box is to talk about the process that is basic and fundamental for the construction of drugs, that is what is related to clinical tests and clinical exams that are developed. So I'll talk about ethics, I'll talk about general law of personal protection data, and also about some specific resolutions of the National Health Council, which is a resolution that deals with tests with human beings. This is the resolution 466 from the National Health Council. This resolution presents some requirements for clinical tests and clinical research. Let's be more generical. Clinical research. This resolution is the main regulatory framework for clinical research in Brazil. And by that, we understand tests with human beings. This resolution, like others that are related to health issues, is a resolution that is based in ethics also. That is, it's not coercive. I mean, this is a resolution that gives ethical attributes, but it's also dependent on other legislation that will take care and establish sanctions in the case of breaking those ethical rules. One of the most important aspects, well, this resolution presents requirements that are already developed in other areas of knowledge, taking into account not only the medical regulation, but also other areas like fundamental rights, protection of personal data, that will be treated by the General Law of Data Protection from 2018. So one of the key elements of this resolution is about the consent that is a requirement for any clinical research, including human beings here in our country. This consentment term is a binding document that establishes, it is established through the lab or the unit responsible for that clinical research test, where many duties are stated on the part of the researchers, and also some transparent information vis-a-vis the treatment of the personal data that is going to be used by those researchers or laboratories. So if we quote between the resolution of the National Health Council and our framework for protection of personal data, which is the law of data protection, we would come to the conclusion that the players included in the resolution, as well as the general law, are similar. They go by different names, but they are very similar. And this has a huge impact on the way how data will be protected, because we will have the necessary combination of these two legal frameworks for the protection of the human being. The first concept I bring to you is the controller. The controller of data, according to the law, is the person responsible for defining the way by which this data will be treated. So he's the major responsible for establishing the dynamics of data protection and data treatment, personal data. If we take this concept to the clinical trials and clinical research, we've come to the conclusion that the sponsor, here we are talking about the pharmaceutical industry, the sponsor in general is the pharmaceutical industry. They are responsible for the clinical trials to prove the effectiveness and the success of that drug. So the sponsor is the controller of personal data. He is the one responsible during the clinical research process. He is responsible for protecting the personal data and also to be compliant to the Brazilian legislation. So this is very clear. The sponsor is the controller. And according to the general law of data protection in Brazil, this position has some legal consequences, like civil responsibility, administrative responsibilities, and this is subject to sanctions that are very severe. The most severe one would be to forbid to treat personal data in Brazil. Let's consider the following situation. A pharmaceutical industry is sponsoring a certain clinical research, and this company does not treat the personal data necessary for the development of the drug, they do not do it in a lawful way, so to speak. If this happens, depending on the severity of this unlawful situation, the national authority to protect data may forbid the company to carry out any type of activity related to clinical research involving personal data. This is the extreme case, of course. There's another one, which is a fine of 50 million reais. Very easy compared to the forbidden of treating the data, But this is also an important consequence that will be imposed on the sponsor of the trial or clinical research. The second player in this situation, the protection of data law and the medical council, is the operator. This is the one who acts on behalf of the controller. He's the one hands-on. He is treating the personal data. So this is a person that acts on behalf of the controller and for the controller. So this may be considered like an independent researcher as the operator. Independent researcher are those who are not related to the sponsor directly by a contract for services or any labor contract. The research center or the research centers, Ana talked about Fiocruz, which is quite famous in Brazil. This research center would be the operator because they will receive this personal data, collect information, share information, have access to, keep those data for the development of that clinical research that has been sponsored by the pharmaceutical industry. And finally, we have the situation of the data, the person in charge of the data. This is a very important position. I am responsible for that at my university, the Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro, and this is a huge responsibility because the person responsible for the data is, after all, the auditor. He's the one responsible for checking if the terms suggested for the treatment of personal data during that research are really being followed, or if there is any necessary adjustment so that the research can be carried out according to the terms that were suggested originally to the people who are participating, in that clinical research.
Besides those three people that are foreseen in the RPD, we have three other figures: the research center, any clinical research. Usually, clinical research are developed in a research center. This center is going to be the operator to collect and process the data that were collected during the research. We have the sponsor, that is the pharmaceutical industry, responsible to initiate the data treatment and also have the consent of the people who are going to participate in the clinical trial. And we have other agents that can be included in this cycle, such as patent offices and other players like law firms and others that can share data with the sponsor. We also have, as important people, the investigator who is very important, but we have other two people that are CEP, that is CEP. It's the Research Ethical Committee. We have a big network of research ethics with human beings. We have centers that are state or regional centers, and we have national centers that are called CONEPs. They are the agencies that are regulatory agencies, and they establish the cornerstones of the clinical research. And they are the ones who check if everything is being done correctly. And ultimately, they are the ones who receive the clinical research, and they are going to approve the efficacy of the drug and its inclusion in the market. And Anvisa, that's going to identify, it's like the American FDA, that's going to identify the efficacy of the products by reading all the reports. So this term of consent, this form of consent, this informed consent that is responsible for personal data, we have another instrument that allows for the treatment of personal data, that is the informed consent. All clinical research must have the consent of those who participate in the test. We have a series of legal hypotheses that give the controller, the sponsor, the fact that they can lead with personal data. In the case of clinical research, the only legal basis that would support this would be the informed consent. That is a document, that is a binding document to the research that will establish not only the aims of the research, that is, what is the subject being researched about, and also the transparency and the goals by the end of the development of the drug. This informed consent, I don't know if you have seen one of those. Those informed consent is full of details because it gives transparency to the clinical research. It must be done in a way that allows the subject to understand the limitations where his personal data will be used. So this informed consent is very relevant, and it will impose the limitation of the clinical research by the sponsor and the research center. Here we have those three pictures of what we have to take care about, the data treatment. The first one has to do with transparency. There is the need of giving the patient or the subject that is being tested and researched the limitations, the boundaries of the clinical research. We are not like a spy film, like a 007, that a clinical research is being carried out to something else besides what the person has been informed about. So transparency is paramount. So this will cover adverse effects that can come from that clinical research, and this will give the subject the fact that he can agree to enter or not the research. And then we have the rights of the patient. as a fundament, the main fundament of the data protection in our country, 4 rights that are for the patient. Those are the access, the opposition, reivindication of that right, and the consent, the fact that you can revoke the consent. Those rights for the subject are broader than that. If we read the general law of data protection and the ethical resolutions, we have other rights that are ensured to the patients. And what is more important is the fact that you can revoke your consent. By the same token that you can consent in the clinical research, you can anytime revoke that consent. And last but not least, we have the ethical conduct. Any research in biomedicine involving the pharmaceutical industry demands an ethical conduct that will allow us to go to the clinical research. And last but not least, we have 2 obligations and 1 goal in any clinical research. The first, besides data protection, that is the ultimate goal, is to protect the personal data of those who participate in the research, because they are sensitive data and they have potential for discrimination, because they can, in a certain way, establish some situations of health care that can lead to stigmatizing that person socially. So the protection of personal data is not only a care, but a duty in this kind of research. But we have 2 obligations that are fundamental. The first is the anonymity of the data. It's not necessary to develop a drug, and Christian has shown a series of statistics. We don't have to make available to the researcher or the research center or society itself who were the subjects of the research. What is important is the statistical evaluation of the result as to the efficacy of the research. That is, if the drug is efficacious or not, and the percentage will allow for that. So the personal data that are used in the clinical trial must be anonymous. The law that protects data doesn't talk about obligation, but I believe that the national authority has the same idea. You must have the anonymity of health data in clinical research. Personal data protected by the general law of data protection identify the subject. The anonymous data are outside this protection. Although it is anonymous, you can have reverse engineering to discover the data, but if they are anonymous, they are outside the law of data protection. That's why it's important to be anonymous, because it's a new level of protection that the industry will bring to itself, so that we are not under LGPD. Anonymity is an instrument of defense to the subject of the research and also for the industry itself.
Que vai ver afastado do âmbito, né, de regulação da sua atividade, a LGPD, a Lei Geral de Proteção de Dados. E o segundo
And the second aspect,
seria, né, dispensado falar, mas
it's pretty obvious, it's confidentiality, medical confidentiality, that is linked to the obligation of secrecy that comes from managing those sensitive data.
comentei rapidamente sobre isso, né? Existem
And finally, there are three important issues that are connected amongst themselves.
primeiro
First
os níveis de anonimização.
is the level of
A anonimização,
anonymity.
devem saber, a anonimização ela
Anonymity has different levels that allows for the knowledge of some or none of personal data.
do nível
So the identification of the level of anonymity
vai estabelecer
will establish
determinada legislação
if
ou não.
certain legislation is applicable or not. The second important point
Resoluções da área médica é o que diz respeito à revogação.
has to do with the
Se o consentimento é a base, é a hipótese
revocation of the consent. You can revoke your consent.
da autonomia para decidir.
As a person, you have the autonomy to decide that I don't want to participate anymore in this
Autonomamente,
research.
revogar esse consentimento.
So you can revoke your consent.
Da mesma forma, né, que o termo de consentimento ele é necessariamente expresso.
You must have informed consent and you can revoke this consent and express it in the medical chart. And finally,
Importante que é a questão da transferência.
we have the portability and the transference and also the deletion of the research data that are also rights that the subject has. Both portability.
Portabilidade significa, né,
Portability means the transference of data of that base from another base. This portability can only be carried out if there is a previous consent of the subject.
diz respeito
The deletion
mais difícil,
is a bit
não, é dificultoso, né? Porque o
to
apagamento
delete the data is a bit more difficult because to delete the data of the subject of a clinical trial would modify the statistics of the clinical test. So we must take it with a grain of salt.
por fim, a gente tem
And lastly, we have the issue
a transferência, né?
of the transference.
Portabilidade, ela é direito
Portability is a right that is going to be granted
dos dados e a
to the data holder, and transference is going to be granted to the controller, the pharmaceutical industry. The transference can only be done like the collection with informed consent. Otherwise, we can't do that
sob pena de causar aí uma
because we would be violating the rights of personality. Thank you very much for your attention.
Caitlin. Temos agora espaço.
Yes, we have time for questions. Not very long. I have a question. First, Kristen,
Regarding what you saw in other countries that applied RDP, which model would you consider most applied to a country as Brazil? To apply it immediately, or any kind of flexibility, any kind of transition period to adopt something like that in Brazil? If you could make some comments on that.
Microphone. Yeah. All right. So to reach the effects, I think we're seeing two different types of models out there. You have the model that applies uniformly across all types of diseases, treatments, medicines. Could be 5 years, is being discussed. I believe Chile and Colombia, Mexico, they have 5 years of data protection, and that's something you see in other parts of the world as well. You also see a discussion which is going on in Europe right now that is trying to do a more flexible or let's say not a uniform data protection, but where it differs according to the type of treatment you're offering or the type of disease in question. So you're trying to classify certain treatments as eligible for higher years of data protection or fewer years of data protection. What we know from that, it's a very complex system, and it becomes a big battleground whether you classify as a treatment or for the high or for the low protection period. And it is a big question mark whether that truly incentivizes the marketing of those that enjoys higher regulatory protection. Up until now, Europe has had a fixed period of data protection in 10 years. So my suggestion is to start implementing data protection. A fixed term that is uniform across all types of treatment diseases is by far the most, let's say, easy and transparent, and it has no additional, let's say, risks or concerns, because you want that to incentivize companies to market and launch new drugs, and by doing it uniformly, you take away any concern whether you classify for something high or low. And when it comes to whether it's good to do immediately or not, it has to get the benefits. That's something that can be immediately implemented. That is not to say that if there are any specific processes or governance structures or so forth that need to be built, that might take some time to do, but there's nothing holding back implementing regulatory data protection and to reap the benefits, looking at it from that perspective.
Thank you, Christian. Thank you very much. Very interesting. Before giving to the audience, I would like to make a question to Professor Caitlin. Caitlin, você comentou bastante sobre...
You talked about clinical data being anonymous and transparent. You said how important all that is. And also, if you don't do that, there are fines, like 50 million reais fines if you do not follow the rules of data, if you share the data without authorization. Can you explain more about sanctions? Do you have a practical example of something that has already happened? Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Anna. Yes. Very quickly. Besides the health agencies that will be responsible for the evaluation of the procedures that are used in clinical research, as well as the supplying of drugs, of course, we have to follow the data protection rules. And this, I guess, we have a double level of regulation. At the health area, we also have a regulation for the data protection area, so we can have this administrative responsibility and also a responsibility on the part of the data protection. As far as data protection, if you're not talking about anonymous data that are not part of this general law of protection, if I talk about personal data that identify the subject in the clinical research, sometimes these data are in a database and there's a problem with the breach of security. If this occurs, and if these personal data are accessed by a third party, we will have a possibility of a sanction that can go through a slap on your hand, some punishment, or the prohibition of using this personal data in the country. It would be very bad for innovation, because this would have an immediate impact. The agent, that sponsor, could not be carry on his clinical research in our country. This is very bad. We have some practical cases. Let me talk about one. I was going to talk about one case, but now I'm changing for another, which is also related to clinical research. It's a bank. Let's think about a bank, a blood bank. And this blood bank is used for clinical research. I don't know if you know, whenever you do any kind of health exam, any blood test, there is a clause saying that your blood is going to be used for anonymous clinical research. Are you aware of that? We are lawyers and we don't read what is written in the contract. So let's suppose this database, this blood bank, was categorized before the anonymity of the data. Before, there was an identification of the subjects that have given blood for clinical research, as if they had a risky sexual behavior. This was a classification because they were carrying on a clinical research in the area of sexuality. This data was not anonymous. There was an incident and the data were revealed. So the pharmaceutical industry and the blood bank that did this kind of thing, you know, they were forbidden to treat the personal data. They closed at the end of the day. That's what happened.
Obrigada, Caitlin. Muito interessante.
Thank you, Caitlin. Very quickly, if there is any question from the audience, please feel free.
Bom dia.
Good morning. I'm Raul Moura. I have a question to Professor Caitlin about revoking the informed consent. I'd like to ask if are consequences about if you revoke the consent at the end of the treatment of data. Is it possible to use those data if the person is not on the test anymore? And perhaps this revocation could have some economic consequences. You know, make the person pay because he left before the test was completed. Thank you, Raul. Raul is a professor at the same university as I am. So if you revoke the consent, you can do it at any time, including after the research is finalized. If the data is anonymous, if you revoke the consent after the research is done, there's no problem. If you do it during the research, when the data are not anonymous, the person can revoke his consent. The consequence is, in his medical record, will be written, he has revoked the consent, and his data will be deleted. And there's no responsibility vis-a-vis the person or the subject who is being the object of the clinical research. Otherwise, nobody would be in that position.
Bom, eu acho que
I think we have to conclude. We are the only ones in the room. It means that everybody is having lunch already. So, thank you very much, Caitlin and Christian, and thank you all for being here. Thank you. Bye-bye.